December 1942, somewhere over the Solomon Islands, 19-year-old Eddie Kowalski stands in the belly of a B-17 with his hands locked around a Browning M2 that trembles like a jackhammer. The bomber smells of oil and cold metal, the floor hums, and the world outside the small opening is a fast, bright chaos. A Japanese Zero slides into view at his 10 o'clock, maybe 300 yards out, moving left to right across his sight like a dart. Eddie does exactly what every training manual told him and every instinct in his body insists he do. This was not an isolated mistake. The same scene repeated thousands of times across every theater of World War II during the early years. Men who were well-trained, brave, and armed with some of the finest machine guns ever built were missing targets constantly. Reports and film from the front confirmed a dreadful pattern. The Army Air Forces ran a study in early 1943 analyzing gun camera footage from bomber missions over Europe and the Pacific, and the results were catastrophic. Trained aerial gunners were achieving hit rates below 4% against crossing targets. 4% meant that for every 100 rounds fired at an enemy aircraft moving perpendicular to the gunner's line of fire, 96 bullets hit nothing but empty air. The math made the situation brutal and clear. A typical dogfight lasted 8 to 12 seconds before the enemy fighter broke off or moved out of range. A Browning M2 fired roughly 800 rounds per minute, about 13 rounds every second. In a 10-second engagement, a gunner could theoretically send 130 rounds into the air. With a 4% hit rate, that translated to about 5 rounds actually striking the target. 5 hits were rarely enough to bring down a Zero or a rugged German fighter like the Focke-Wulf FW-190. Those fighters could absorb dozens of 50 caliber rounds and keep flying. The human cost was staggering and immediate. In 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force lost on average 188 bombers every month over Europe. Each B-17 carried 10 men, meaning roughly 1,880 aircrew were lost, killed, captured, or missing every 30 days. A significant portion of those losses came from formations that could not defend themselves effectively because their gunners could not connect. The problem was not courage or effort. Gunners tracked targets, maintained sight picture, and controlled bursts. They did what their instructors had taught them under rigid training regimens. The real problem was physics, a cold, impersonal force that did not respect bravery. Every gunner instinctively aimed directly at what they saw. That logic works fine on a firing range or against a slow-moving terrestrial target, but it failed in the three-dimensional, high-speed world of aerial combat. Enemy fighters crossed a gunner's field of view at speeds often exceeding 300 miles per hour. Even though a 50 caliber bullet left the barrel at roughly 2,900 feet per second, the distance, speed, and closure rates meant the target was not where it was perceived to be by the time the bullet arrived. A simple example made the gap plain. A Zero flying at 300 miles per hour covered 440 feet each second. At 300 yards, about 900 feet, a bullet traveling at 2,900 feet per second required approximately 0.31 seconds to reach that distance. Those 0.3 of a second were enough for the fighter to move forward another 136 feet, roughly 11 car lengths. The gunner aimed at what he could see, but the bullet arrived at where the aircraft had been a third of a second earlier, passing through empty space while the enemy flew on. This was deflection error in action, and its scale was larger and more counterintuitive than training had prepared anyone to handle. Those mathematical realities were known in theory before the war. Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle published a technical analysis called The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery in 1924, setting out tables and formulas showing how much lead was required at varying speeds and ranges. Puckle's numbers were brutal and precise, showing with clarity that as aircraft speeds rose above 150 miles per hour, required lead angles exceeded human intuitive ability. A 200-yard shot at a 90-degree crossing angle against a target moving at 300 miles per hour required on the order of 47 feet of lead, the equivalent of multiple aircraft lengths. The paper sat in a filing cabinet while aviation advanced rapidly in the 1920s and 1930s, but training doctrine did not follow. Instructors continued to teach fundamentals that worked for rifles and slow targets, rather than teaching systems that matched the new reality of high-speed flight. When the United States entered the war, gunnery training was catastrophically underprepared. The standard course lasted 4 weeks and students fired roughly 1,000 rounds in total, mostly at stationary or slowly towed targets. Nothing replicated the chaotic geometry of a 300-mile-per-hour fighter diving through a bomber box. Trainees graduated, shipped to England or the Pacific, and discovered that their classroom knowledge had little value the first time a Zero flashed across their sight. By mid-1942, some commanders began combing old reports for guidance. A captain named Robert Williams in the 8th Air Force found Puckle's paper in the archives, recognized the grim accuracy of the calculations, and understood that the problem was not academic but mortal. The math did not change, but implementation did not follow without innovation. The British found practical answers born of desperation during the Battle of Britain. Squadron 609 of the RAF experimented in August 1940 in a way that directly challenged established doctrine. Squadron leader Horace Darley instructed his pilots not to aim in the traditional way. Instead, he had them track targets with the aircraft's motion and fire while the plane was still turning, trusting peripheral vision and the subconscious sense of motion to naturally create the required lead. The pilots practiced repeatedly with a towed banner until their brains learned to predict where the target would be rather than where it was in that instant. Their hit rates rose from small single digits to something significantly better, demonstrating that the human brain could, with training, develop an instinctive feel for lead without conscious calculation. The RAF's discovery applied to fighter pilots who could use motion and bank turns to create deflection, but it did not translate directly to bomber gunners who were fixed in position, unable to maneuver their aircraft to produce lead. The solution for those men had to be mechanical and practical. Engineers and scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, working in the radiation laboratory under Dr. Charles Starkdraper, tackled the problem with instruments and analog computing. Draper's team built a computing gun sight, the Mark 14, which combined gyroscopes, cams, and gears to measure target angular velocity and compute lead in real time. The gunner provided range by matching reference marks to the target's wingspan, tracked the target for a brief period, and the sight produced a floating reticle that indicated where to aim. The device solved complex ballistic mathematics 30 times per second and turned a blind guess into a guided aim point. Testing in the United States produced dramatic improvements. Gunners using the Mark 14 saw hit rates climb from single-digit percentages to around 18% on first use and above 25% after several days of practice. That improvement translated directly into more damaged or destroyed enemy fighters and fewer bomber losses. The Mark 14 was a breakthrough, but production and installation were slow. The Allies could not equip every bomber immediately, and retrofitting existing fleets took time. Many crews continued to fly through late 1943 and early 1944 with only iron sights or primitive reflectors, which left them vulnerable until mechanical solutions became widely available. The parallel breakthrough came from combat experience in the Pacific, where visibility and engagement ranges allowed empirical methods to flourish. Staff Sergeant William Fleming, a waist gunner with thousands of rounds fired, kept a small notebook of sketches showing where he aimed during successful engagements. Fleming's simple measurement technique used target size as a visual ruler, instructing gunners to lead by 1 aircraft length for slight crossing angles, 2 lengths for moderate angles, and 3 or more for steep crosses. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare recognized the value of Fleming's empirical data and pushed it into training. The method, called spot shooting, gave gunners a visual and instantly applicable standard that required no complex math and could be taught quickly aboard carriers and in squadron briefings. The spot shooting method spread rapidly through the Pacific Fleet and later into Army Air Force training. It improved hit rates dramatically because it matched how the human visual system naturally works. People are better at judging relative sizes and using them as references than at estimating absolute distances. Counting plane lengths ahead of the nose created an immediate, repeatable method for leading. Fleeting seconds of combat did not allow for conscious trigonometry, but counting and visual comparison could be executed automatically when drilled repeatedly. Naval and Army gunnery schools adjusted their programs to emphasize moving target practice and visual lead techniques, expanding course lengths and ammunition allocations as the war progressed. Even with improved techniques and computing sites, the human mind still posed a barrier under stress. Psychologists embedded with gunnery commands documented a phenomenon called threat fixation collapse, where gunners, under increasing perceived danger, would revert to the instinct to aim at the visible threat. The pattern showed up on gun camera films and in debriefings. Gunners would start engagements using proper lead, but as the enemy closed and the need felt urgent, their aim would drift backward until they were firing directly at the target. The only reliable way to prevent that collapse was mastery through repetition that moved the technique out of the conscious mind and into reflex. By late 1944, training pipelines had adapted. Courses expanded to 8 or 10 weeks, trainees fired 5,000 rounds instead of 1,000, and more time was spent on dynamic, high-speed target practice. Schools mounted movable turrets, towed targets at higher speeds, and designed drills that reinforced automatic leading. The outcomes were visible in combat. Experienced gunners who had completed extended practice and survived many missions developed an almost uncanny ability to maintain correct lead even when fear told them otherwise. Their hands and eyes worked as one, creating a no-mind state where technique persisted despite terror. The aggregate effect of these changes was profound. Hit rates that had been around 4% climbed into double digits for many units, and computing sites delivered even higher results. The transformation from ineffectual defensive fire to a far more capable umbrella over bomber formations changed the air war's calculus. Loss rates that had been unsustainably high began to fall as more enemy fighters were damaged or destroyed and fewer bomber crewmen were lost. The change saved lives and made strategic bombing campaigns more viable by giving formations a fighting chance to reach their targets and return. The lessons of that brutal, costly learning curve reached far beyond World War II. The principle that one must aim where a target will be, not where it is, became foundational for every subsequent fire control system. Mechanical computing sites evolved into digital systems, radar-assisted guns, and ultimately the missile guidance and prediction systems of the modern era. The same core idea underpins shipboard close-in weapon systems and modern aircraft radars that predict future positions. The story of men like Eddie Kowalski and William Fleming shows that the gulf between human instinct and physical reality can be bridged through invention, adapted training, and stubborn, repeated practice that reprograms reflexes to match the demands of the world. The final lesson is a human one, and it carries beyond war. Where instinct and reality diverge, survival depends on the willingness to change how we act, to build tools that solve what our bodies cannot, and to transform training until new responses become second nature. The dead and wounded from those early, costly months of the air war remind us that adaptation can be delayed only at terrible expense. The men who learned to aim into empty sky and trust their bullets to meet metal did not do so because they were less afraid. They did it because they were taught better methods, given more practice, or entrusted to new instruments that freed them from impossible mental arithmetic. Their story is a study in physics, invention, psychology, and the stubborn human capacity to learn under pressure.